Good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome to the fifth webinar in our LLG Talking Procurement series. My name is Kieran McGahey. I'm a Director of LLG and our National Lead for Procurement. We're delighted to be joined today by some of the team at Anthony Collins Solicitors, Corporate Partners of LLG. We have Alex Lawrence and Martin Brown, who have kindly given up their time to join us this morning, and they are going to be talking about procuring public projects.
Thank you, Kieran. So just a bit of background about us. My name's Alex Lawrence and I'm a Senior Associate in the local government team here at Anthony Collins. My career's been a mix of being in private practice and in-house within local government, and I specialise in public procurement, local government projects and general local government law. Basically anything to do with local government that's not litigation or property usually ends up with me. And I do a lot of work on procuring projects, particularly joint ventures for local authorities. I'm here with my colleague Martin, who I'll hand over now to introduce himself.
Morning, everyone. Yes, thanks, Alex. I also do a lot of work in public projects. Really enjoy supporting public sector clients to get their really exciting projects off the ground. In terms of my involvement, typically I get involved anywhere where there's a works element, because I'm mostly a construction lawyer, although I also like getting involved in the public procurement and subsidies aspects.
So we're going to start with some audience participation. So as you will no doubt all know, just before Christmas, the government published its long-awaited green paper, Transforming Public Procurement, and trailed a number of possible changes to how we deal with public procurement in the UK. And Martin's going to talk about the contents of the Green Paper. But I was struck on reading it by the ministerial foreword, and particularly the paragraph that you can see on the screen there that the minister really heroes in on as the motivation for the government to act here, and references to the public procurement regime being outdated, and how he has observed it making it much harder to create opportunities for innovative companies to win business and improve public services, or to exclude suppliers who performed poorly in the past. And so we're going to launch a poll now. It's a very binary choice. It's a do you agree with it or not? But I'd be really interested to see what people's take is on that snapshot of the government's views on the public procurement system.
I'm not sure if everyone can see the results. We had a little over 70% agreed, just under 30% disagreed. I mean, interesting response, I think, Alex. I mean, from my perspective, I think there are parts of it I agreed with, but like quite a lot of the Green Paper, I thought it was quite a strong statement. We didn't really give our participants the chance to sit on the fence like that, but yeah, interesting to see a strong majority in favour of it.
Yeah, I think we were being slightly cruel not to have a down the middle approach to it. I think I'd certainly agree that there are issues with the current system, and I think there's definitely a question about whether all of the proposals that are in the Green Paper really do address the issues that there are with it. That was just a snapshot to begin with, to just try and see where people's thinking was about how the procurement regime works at the moment. Obviously, for now, we're stuck with it as it is. So the remainder of this webinar is going to focus on the rules as they are. And then, as I say, Martin's going to talk about so some of the things in the Green Paper towards the end. So if you're going to be procuring a project of whatever type, I wanted to start by looking at some of the things that you should be dealing with right at the very beginning of the project and setting out what you're going to do. First of those is I think a really obvious one. It's about making sure that you're clear on what your priorities and objectives are, and the particular outcomes that you're seeking to achieve from the procurement. And where you and your colleagues are clear on them, is there buy-in across the authority, from members, from senior officers, and also out into the community who may be affected by the project. And it may be that you've undertaken a consultation, or you feel that it would be appropriate, or you're required to undertake a consultation process to inform the procurement process. This takes on an added dimension if you're working with other partners through some form of joint procurement, to make sure that all of the partners are on the same page as to what you're trying to do here and how you're going to do it. Secondly, looking at your team for the procurement. This is the case in all of the procurement process, but particularly when you're procuring larger projects. It's about assessing what expertise you do need to be on the team, whether you have that capability to deliver that expertise in-house. And if you don't have the capacity, then do you need to recruit or engage external advisors to bolster the team? And once you've worked out who your team's going to be and where they're all going to come from, sending out at a really early stage the protocols about how the team is going to work together, so that as far as possible it's a seamless process, even if you've got people from a number of different organisations involved. It's local government, so obviously VIRES is really important, and it'll need to be assessed in all cases, and in most of them it's not going to be an issue because it'll be really clear what your powers are. But for some projects it could not always be clear at first glance what functions you're relying upon as an authority. So undertaking that assessment at an early stage as to the functions you're relying upon, and making sure you understand all of the conditions and obligations that come with those functions, and build that in as a golden thread running through all of your procurement and contractual documents. Also, if we think about governance for the authority, that's governance relating both to the process itself that you're going to undertake, but also thinking about when you get to the end and you've signed all the contracts and set up any new vehicles, how are you going to govern what's been procured? To what extent are members going to be involved in both the process and the result of your procurement? The extent of any delegated authority from cabinet down to individual members, or perhaps more likely down to senior officers. And if you are doing joint procurements with other contracting authorities, whether that's NHS bodies or other local authorities, what arrangements are you going to have in place both during the process and once the contracts are awarded, to govern how you'll work together, how you'll make decisions, and ensure that you're managing any third parties in a consistent way to help with the running of the eventual project. Risk is another really important factor to look at the beginning, assessing the overall corporate appetite for risk across all projects, and then on your particular project, identifying the risks that there are, stress testing those risks. What if the worst happens, what would you do? And then thinking about the mitigating steps and contingencies you can put in place to manage that risk. The next one I've put there is thinking about, well, actually, is what you're doing procurable? It can be easy to assume when you're looking at a fairly large project and the outcomes you want to achieve, to just assume that it's going to be a procurable arrangement. And I should say we're certainly not talking here about using artifice and trying to break things down in a deliberate way to fall outside of the procurement rules, which would obviously would be improper. But certainly my approach is always with projects to start with a blank sheet of paper and map out who's involved, what contracts need to be in place, what new vehicles may need to be set up, and then assess in each of those relationships whether from the outset or at some point down the road there needs to be a contract for services, supplies or works entered into by a contracting authority. And if there's not, then do you need to do a procurement process, or could you, if you may already have a partner in mind that you want to work with, and it's certainly easier if there's no procurable contract there. But if you don't, what type of process are you going to run that may be very similar to a procurement process to find out who the best partner for you is and who allows you to achieve what you want to do? And finally, on this slide, soft market testing. So we've had the flexibility under the procurement regs to do soft market testing for a while now, and it is done on a frequent basis. It's permitted provided that the eventual process that you run for the procurement is still going to be compliant with those general principles, and you're not giving an advantage to anyone who might participate either in the design or running of the process or as a market operator who's engaging with you through the process. And particularly where you're doing something new or innovative, then soft market testing is really essential for seeing how the market could respond, whether they will actually want to partner with you on this particular type of project, whether in fact they can offer you what you want to achieve. And we'll talk later on when we look at procurement processes. If the market can deliver but what you want is not readily available, then that's going to impact on the particular process that you'll choose going down the line. If we think about then legal documents that need to be in place and other documents, obviously very important, so important that we didn't actually put it on the slide, is the general procurement documents. So your contract notice, crucial to get the description right of your project and the scope and financial envelope of the project, because the contract notice is going to be one of the key documents if you need to make changes down the line as to whether the change is permitted or not. The SQ or the PAS 91, if you're looking at a construction contract, which Martin would be much more familiar than I am. Obviously, the broad terms of the selection documentation are already set, that there is some ability to depart from them. But thinking about where you've got project-specific questions and other questions where you need to set the metric by which you're going to assess the suitability of potential partners is going to be really important at any stage. And then your invitation documentation. That could just be an invitation to tender, or it could be an invitation to participate in dialogue if you're looking at one of the negotiation or dialogue processes. The key point here is that all of your documents need to transparently set out what you want, how the process is going to run, and how you'll evaluate the bids going down the line. You don't want to leave any ambiguity on crucial points, because where you leave ambiguity and then try to rely on that ambiguity down the line, you're at risk of challenge from disgruntled bidders. And in those procurement documents and the eventual contractual documents, you want to ensure that your priorities that we talked about on the previous slide have been dealt with throughout the documentation and into the contract, so that you can enforce delivery against those priorities down the line. Looking at legal documents in particular, so there could be a range of contracts for services or supplies. Certain projects do require new entities to be set up, either just for the contracting authority or as joint venture entities for the project. And so you'll have a range of governance and control documents, such as articles of association or an LLP member agreement. Particularly where you've got those new entities, you could have support service contracts between the authority and the new entity. And there undoubtedly may be some funding documentation involved in any project, whether that's loans and security documents, or it could even just be grant funding. And when we're thinking about funding documents here, it's not just you as the authority providing funding down into the project, but it's also, particularly with grant funding, you getting funding from other public sources as well, and ensuring that you factor in the terms of that funding into how you design the process and your own contractual documents. And then also thinking about guarantees and bonds that may be relevant, particularly when you're looking at construction contracts. So that's documents from a general procurement and commercial contracts perspective. I'm going to hand over to Martin, who's going to talk about the construction angle on legal documents.
Yes, thanks, Alex. So as I said in my introduction, I'm first and foremost, I'm a construction lawyer. When we start talking about works contracts, that's where I really come to life in a public project. It's always really interesting talking to clients about what direction they want to take with their form of construction contract. Usually, it's driven by what they're familiar with, what the contract management team understand, are comfortable with, or possibly if they're procuring project management support, where their expertise lies. But there are interesting elements to what I set out of what I think are the main options, which are JCT, NEC, or bespoke. And they all have pros and cons when setting up a project. JCT is well understood. The market knows it very well, but it's very contractor friendly. It does require amendment, including on the risk profile, but it also requires amendment for any public project to support regulatory compliance. And there I'm talking about things like bringing in compliance with freedom of information, data protection, modern slavery. And because JCT isn't designed in a way which anticipates amendment, you shoehorn them in through a schedule of amendments, a handwritten amendment on the booklet itself saying we've got a new article, making sure that the changes through the schedule of amendments do take effect. And it is a slightly rough and ready way of putting a contract together. And because the risk profile does need tweaking, it's not my favourite option. As I say, it really depends on where the client's comfortable. I much prefer NEC, provided a client's familiar with it and has the resource to administer it properly. I think it's a brilliant form of contract, works really well. Once you get used to it, it just makes sense. There are lots of pitfalls in it if you're not familiar with it. So it's really important, if you're going with NEC, that your contract manager knows the way around it, has experience with it. There are training programs that NEC run so that they can have NEC accreditation, and that can be a really helpful question. If you're procuring contract management support externally, you can ask them, are they accredited with this form of contract? But the reasons I like it are partnering approach means it shares risk in a way which I think is reasonable and doesn't require significant tweaking through the Z clauses. Plus, because it anticipates the use of Z clauses through the contract data, building up support around regulatory compliance fits within the document structure that NEC anticipates, and it can just result in a much cleaner form of contract altogether. The third, well, I say the main option is going bespoke. That's usually appropriate where a client's already got a bespoke form of contract that they like, they know the way around, and are keen to stick with. There are some fairly significant disadvantages of bespoke when going out to market, because obviously no bidder other than perhaps the incumbent is going to be familiar with it. And when going out in procurement, we always want to do what we can to attract the best possible bids, and having a contract which every prospective bidder has to get familiar with from scratch and understand the risk profile from scratch isn't going to be ideal. Not necessarily going to put people off, but it's not going to help. And yeah, when considering setting it up, regardless of what form you go for, the question is still the same. We're always trying to juggle what the client's appetite for risk is against what the market's going to go for. And some of the big points are liability caps, always a contentious one. Interestingly, JCT doesn't build one in the unamended form, but it's always an interesting question. Do we go out offering a cap, or do we ask the market to suggest one, or do we try and get away with unlimited liability? And it depends on the project and where the market's at, and commercial experience and familiarity of the market in that sector can really help there. Other big points can be site conditions, depending on what we're talking about, and how you want to set things up. So I mentioned two of the main structures, which is prime contractor, where we're flowing all of the supply chain through the contractor being appointed, including design responsibility, versus traditional build, where they're doing basically the building work, and we're contracting directly with the rest of the supply chain. I mean, the advantage of a prime contractor is pretty obvious. You've got someone on the hook for everything, and it's widely used. If you've got a particular relationship with a supply chain, or possibly you may not have, you may have brought people on board along the way and don't want, whatever reason, don't want to novate them over, or don't think the contractor's going to be comfortable taking over design responsibility, traditional build may be more appropriate.
So if we move now to thinking about procurement routes that you might take with your project. I mentioned earlier on about mapping out your project and working out where the procurable contracts are. And the result of doing that is that you could, especially on particularly large projects, end up with a single procurement, or there may be several procurements. So you might have multiple head contractors for different aspects, or you could have a single head contractor that you're dealing with a number of important subcontractors. And so depending upon where you are in that will influence the exact procurement route that you're going to use. We've mentioned already managing risk through the process, and ensuring that the risks that you've identified are clearly catered for in the procurement documentation and the contractual documentation. Once you've identified the different contracts that you need to procure, as is always the case, the next step is to think about valuation of those contracts, and in particular where they've been properly disaggregated from other contracts for the project. And really important there, if you have got some that are under threshold procurements, then obviously the route forward is more straightforward and in line with your own contract standing orders, and those limited provisions that there are under Part 4 of the Public Contracts Regulations. I mentioned earlier on about soft market testing and really understanding whether the market can deliver what you want it to, and how that will impact upon the type of procurement process that you select. If the solution is readily available from the market and your requirements are well understood and not uncommon, then you're probably looking at something like the open or restricted procedure, depending upon whether you want that separate selection stage or not. Well-trodden processes that everyone will be familiar with. If, however, what you want from the market isn't readily available, then you could start to think about whether competitive procedure with negotiation or competitive dialogue may be necessary. And I'm going to talk about a bit more about those on the next slide. If what you want is readily available from the market, then it may be that you can use framework agreement to secure what you want to achieve. And obviously there it's important to ensure that, one, you're covered by the original contract notice as an authority that can call off, and that what it is that you want specifically is covered by the specification, and to what extent there's any flexibility in that specification to shape to what you want to achieve. And then not only being sure that the specification works for you, but ensuring that the contract works for you as drafted. As you'll all know, there's limited opportunity to vary call-off contract terms without having to comply with Regulation 72. And if you are going to have to go down the route of making quite substantial variations that aren't covered, then you can put at risk the compliance of calling off through the framework agreement. So you may start to think, well, actually, we might as well just do our own process, get exactly what it is that we want. I mentioned joint procurements earlier on, and it's also the case that with some public projects, all of the parties involved may well be contracting authorities, and the parties delivering are contracting authorities. And so there, it may be appropriate to consider whether Regulation 12 of the Public Contracts Regulations would be appropriate. So there we've got TECL vehicles, either single control or joint control with other contracting authorities. And you see that a lot with shared services being used through those vehicles, or particularly if you might have a service that you are bringing back in-house but don't want to bring it completely back in-house because you want to retain some greater flexibility, or a service that you're looking to move from direct authority control to give that flexibility and take advantage of any trading latitude that there may be. And then you've got the other option under Regulation 12.7 of using intermunicipal cooperation. So it's obviously the lesser used cousin of the TECL exemption, but certainly one that's useful, considering if you are just talking about contracting authorities doing things together, and you can clearly show the cooperative nature of what you're doing. And there's been some recent case law during the course of last year from the European Court of Justice on using that exemption. I think whilst it is a flexible one, it is not a process through which you can just directly award a contract to another contracting authority. There does have to be a genuine cooperation there, and that's certainly the way I've always thought of it. And I don't think the case law changes this, is whilst you don't all have to be doing things to the same degree, everyone who's part of the corporation needs to be contributing something to the corporation beyond just paying for a service to be delivered. So we're going to go on now to look in a bit more detail at competitive procedure with negotiation and competitive dialogue. Certainly with public projects, particularly where, as I've said, the requirement isn't well understood by the market or readily available, or where there are elements of what you're doing that do really need some engagement with the contractor to enable the best deal to be obtained by the authority, then these processes are the way forward. So just to get a bit of understanding about levels of experience on this, we're going to launch another poll, so Martin will take care of that. And although the question is, have you used CPN and competitive dialogue, either or is fine.
So there we go. About two thirds. No, one third. Yes.
Yeah, so that's not altogether surprising, and certainly the green paper talks about, when it looks at potential reforms to processes, how infrequently these two procedures are used. And I can certainly count on one hand the number of times I've advised on them. Most clients tend to go with the open or restricted procedure, but they are appropriate in certain circumstances. So if we look at those in a bit more detail, the first thing to say is that if you want to use competitive procedure with negotiation or competitive dialogue, then there are preconditions to using them, and these are set out in Regulation 26.4. Now they're not particularly onerous conditions, but you can see what the public contracts regulations are getting at. There's one around where you've only received irregular unacceptable tenders. I'm going to ignore that one for now. But they include that the needs of the authority cannot be met without adapting available solutions. One that I think is really useful is that the contract cannot be awarded without prior negotiation because of specific circumstances related to the nature, the complexity, or the legal and financial makeup, or because of the risks attaching to them. That's a fairly broad condition there that most major projects are probably capable of falling within. And another one is where technical specifications cannot be established with sufficient precision by reference to an accepted standard. So not difficult to satisfy, but if you are going to look at using these procedures, then you need to make sure that in your procurement report and your decision-making reports that you've outlined why you meet those conditions for use here. A competitive procedure with negotiation is dealt with under Regulation 29. And I've always taken the view, and I think others that I've listened to speak on this have said, it's basically restricted plus, and that's really reflected by the fact that the authority can reserve the right in the contract notice and procurement documents that when they get the initial tenders in, they can just decide to not negotiate at all and just award on the basis of the initial tenders. You might be thinking, well, what's the difference between CPN and CD? CPN is usually used in a situation where the requirements are clear and broadly the solution's clear, but what the authority feels is needed is an ability to negotiate to improve the contents of the bids. So it's not full come to us with a complete solution that we don't really know what that solution is going to be. It's about improving quality and content of the bids. Just as with competitive dialogue, when you're running the negotiation, a lot of care has to be taken to preserve transparency and equal treatment, but without breaching confidentiality of the individual bids. With competitive dialogue that's set out at Regulation 30, the authority tends to know the requirements that it has and the outcomes it wants to achieve, but either the whole or certain parts of the way it gets there, the solution, are unknown, and it needs the market to come back with proposals as to how the solution could be structured. The competitive dialogue regulations set out a broad framework for how the process is to be run, but it incorporates quite a good deal of flexibility around how your dialogue is structured and operated, which can be a good thing. It allows you to get the dialogue into the place that you actually want it to be, and that could be a dialogue on everything, or more likely it's going to be a very targeted dialogue on particular aspects. Another difference from competitive procedure with negotiation, under CPN, once you've asked for final tenders, there's no scope for any further negotiation, but under competitive dialogue, there is some limited scope to clarify, specify and optimize final tenders, provided that it doesn't change essential aspects, where that's likely to distort competition or have a discriminatory effect. It's also the case that once you get to preferred bidder stage in a competitive dialogue, there is also some scope for further negotiation at that stage, but it is within very tightly controlled parameters. I've already mentioned that it's important with any procurement to think about your experience, but I think as our poll has shown, really important here with either competitive procedure or competitive dialogue to think about what experience and capacity your authority has to run this type of process. And that's both from a process perspective, so have you got the right procurement advisors, the right legal team in place to support the process. But because these processes are factored around negotiation and dialogue, at its heart, there's a commercial deal to be done here within the boundary of procurement law. So have you got the right people in place who will be able to lead those commercial negotiations? And to go into a room, whether that's virtual or an actual room, and really hold the bidders to account against what they're supposed to be doing in the process. And also thinking about, well, is the market going to be interested in this type of process? That can be a particular issue where you're clear that you need to do something, that open or restricted isn't going to work here. But a tension between whether it needs to be competitive procedure with negotiation or competitive dialogue, and certainly competitive dialogue has a not great reputation, and there are some examples of it going on for years, which most bidders are not going to want to do. So think about what the market is used to here, and again, this is where soft market testing can be really important with this type of process. With both processes, be really clear about what your minimum requirements are, your red lines. That's important both from a procurement perspective. There are some things that you can't change once you have set them out in the procurement documents, but also from a negotiation perspective, being really clear what your red lines are and what you won't resile away from. Also important to think about from the other side as well, when you're setting out your requirements. What is the market actually going to want here? What's generally accepted? What are their barriers? You know, is a complete and total assignment of all risk to the contractor really going to be acceptable here? And are you going to get anyone who's going to engage on the process? Thinking about it at an early stage, what your topics for negotiation and dialogue are. Setting out really clearly how the process is going to work, who's your negotiating team, your backup team, how's the evaluation going to be handled, and then your reward criteria. They're another aspect along with minimum requirements that can't be changed throughout the process. So your reward criteria need to be designed to potentially work across multiple stages, but also particularly with competitive dialogue, to be able to compare potentially very different solutions to the requirements in a fair, transparent, and equal way. And then finally, I'd just say these processes are riskier than open or restricted. It doesn't mean you don't use them. Everything's got risk involved in it, but it does mean that you need to do a good deal of planning at an early stage and front load a lot of work to make sure that you're going into this with eyes open. And also keep in mind that even with a relatively short process, bidders will be investing a lot more time and money in the process than they would be under an open or restricted procurement. Procurements for using these procedures tend to be higher value, and that means that disgruntled bidders have got a lot more at stake and maybe a lot more willing to challenge where there are errors in the process. And also because there's flexibility here and not everything is spelled out in detail by the regulations, that means there's a lot more grey in how you approach things, which again can create more scope for potential challenge. So it's about anticipating where those challenges could come from and then designing the process accordingly. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Martin, who's going to talk about subsidy control, which is everybody's favourite topic.
Yeah, absolutely. We all love it. Don't we just love it when we get halfway through a project and someone mutters the words until Christmas, state aid. Now we've got subsidies, and I think we were all delighted to hear that the government managed to kick out the state aid regime. And you start reading. Well, I don't know how many delegates have had the pleasure of reading the technical guidance on subsidies yet. But you start reading, you think, oh, this sounds great. You know, we've really gone through. We've really loosened the shackles, got rid of some of the red tape here. But then you really get into it, and we've got a 4-part test. It depends on whether you're engaging in goods or services, but it's broadly financial contribution by a public authority giving an economic advantage, not normally available in market terms, causing distortion. Lots of new terminology there, but blimey, it sounds pretty familiar for a state aid lawyer, to the point where I'm not sure when we would have a measure that was state aid before Christmas that wouldn't be that we could be confident wouldn't be a subsidy now. So the government's obviously tried very hard to deregulate this area. And broadly speaking, I think we're in a pretty similar situation to where we were before Christmas. There are areas, I think, where things are a bit more lightweight, and hopefully are going to carry on being a little bit more lightweight. In particular, Commission guidance on state aid doesn't apply now. I should just note, unless we're talking about a measure which affects trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU, in which case the whole state aid regime kicks in. But otherwise, the Commission guidance on state aid doesn't apply. And I have to say, there were some elements about those guidance documents which I found very tricky to reconcile with real life, frankly. Some of the examples are guidance on benchmarking with market rates. I don't know if anyone attending sat down and read them, but they go on, and you just think, how on earth am I ever going to do this properly without missing a step on a real life project? Another one is Commission guidance on how to sell public assets for at an undervalue, which you would hope would link through to the Secretary of State consents, but actually when you read them, basically tell you can't do it. So yeah, I'm really hoping that this gives an opportunity to step away from that end of things. Some of the positive elements are, I think, when you get into whether a subsidy is prohibited, it does start to feel a bit friendlier. It's things like export performance. You can't go off and try to help out an insolvent company where you've got no real chance of getting them back to viability. So things like that, you say, oh, well, that's fair enough. We don't have GBA equivalents and all those block exemption equivalents at the minute. It'd be interesting to see to what extent we need them. I've seen some speculation that it's a massive gap in the regime. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure to what extent it is, given that most of the principles are quite easy to apply. You wouldn't normally be in breach of most of them, in my view, unless you are doing something a little bit dodgy. But yeah, maybe we'll see some more safe harbour legislation. I think we can only hope if we do, it will be easier to administer than GBA. Surely, we've got a new regime for SPEI, which is equivalent to SGEI. So we're talking about services in the public economic interest. It is slightly easier to administer. It's very similar to the rules before, but it doesn't get quite so bogged down as we did in the SGEI decision. And the other area where I think things are looking a bit friendlier, I was pleased to see, is around reporting requirements. I was always nervous supporting clients with GBA around when you get into the reporting elements, because I think it's like two weeks to report, and if you don't, you've just lost the chance to keep within the block exemption, and you've suddenly got unlawful state aid. Whereas now the 6 months, we haven't actually got the database set up yet. Apparently BEIS are working on it at the minute, but obviously 6 months is a fair amount of time, so hopefully that'll come through soon. So yeah, so elements where there's room for optimism. Broadly speaking, though, I think take what the technical guidance says with a pinch of salt. We're largely in a similar place to where we were before. And just to bring everything home, obviously what we're talking about here is procuring public projects. Subsidies regime really kicks in whenever you're talking about moving public funds from one place to another. Yeah, to the next slide saying is funding on commercial terms or by grants. Yeah, if we're going through a full final tender process or LLG process, we should be fairly confident that we're sticking with market terms. Places to watch out for are particularly if you get involved in joint ventures or moving funds to a local authority subsidiary. Sometimes I come across clients making reference to intrastate transfers. And I think a lot of care needs to be taken there. It shouldn't be used as a carte blanche for moving funds around. The test of whether you've got a subsidy does need to be considered whenever you're moving public funds between entities. That brings us on to where we're looking now and moving forward on the procurement side. As I say, public procurement should rinse out a subsidy by ensuring funds are on market terms. At the minute, the way that's done is very much the same as it was before. We've got the find a tender service, which replaces OJU, but otherwise the rules are very much the same. Looking forwards, the green paper's out for consultation at the minute. It's an interesting document. Seems to be a lot of good stuff in there. As I mentioned on my view on the quote at the beginning, in quite a few places really, it makes statements which I feel can be a bit strong. There's clearly an agenda to emphasise the need for deregulation. That's such a key element of what's spurred Brexit along. It's the same on when the government's talking about subsidies, when it's talking about public procurement. So, for example, one of the statements in the green paper, which I really do take issue with, is it references that we currently have 350 regulations. I can only think what they mean is that there are 350 individual regulations. So, for example, in the public contracts regs, there are, I don't know, about up to 100. And then you've got up to 100 more in utilities regs and so on. And when you start looking at it like that, it's a bit of an overrate to criticise a regime for that number of regulations, when in reality, say if we look at the utilities regs versus public contracts regs, the first question, if you're ever in any doubt of whether you're acting as a utility or not, should be, am I acting as a utility or not? You then decide which of the sets of rules apply, and you follow that set of rules, and they're largely set out in one set of regulations, obviously informed by case law. So from my perspective, the current regime isn't that bad. That said, it's always good to hear about making government trying to make things simpler, easier to use in practice. Definitely on board with that. I'm also on board with the proposals to consolidate legislation, because utilities versus public contracts regs is a really good example of some really similar procedures, like really similar but slightly different procedures depending on whether you're acting as a utility or another contracting authority, in ways which don't always, it's not really clear why they're different the way they do. And also the two sets of regulations interact with each other. The utilities regs pull across elements of the public contract regulations. So it certainly seems very sensible to have a single resource to go to. And reducing the number of procedures also seems sensible. I think the plan is there's going to be a streamlined open procedure, a procedure that builds an element of negotiation, and then a procedure to deal with urgent or emergency procurements. Plus, the government wants to encourage further use of dynamic purchasing systems, and so that's been kept in as well. And similarly, it's proposing scope to make it easier to use framework agreements for longer. I think it seems a good shout. The Commission was never isn't keen on framework agreements. Has always tried to discourage their use, particularly by limiting them to 4 years. The government wants to have an extra option for an open framework, which has closed elements and open elements, which are periods of time when further bidders can apply to join the framework, with an option to go up to, I think, eight years in total. And as I say, lots of good stuff there. But also, the government wants to make the dispute resolution procedure simplified, as well as building all this additional flexibility through the new regime. And that's where I start to get slightly nervous, because again, it sounds good. Make it easier to resolve disputes, make it quicker, make it easier for small businesses to sort out their disputes more easily, introduce a new tribunal system, I should say. That all sounds great, but then when you start looking at the whole picture, it feels like there's a risk that where we're going to end up with is a more flexible regime, which equates to less legal certainty, coupled with making it much easier for disgruntled bidders to raise challenges, and altogether not properly managed, that could result in a surge in procurement disputes, which could actually make the whole process even more unwieldy than it is right now, with notwithstanding the intention being the opposite. So it's really interesting. Lots of good stuff in there, but that's the point where I just get a little bit nervous. Is how far is the government going to go with this, and have they thought through the ramifications of a much easier dispute resolution procedure for local authorities who are trying to carry on with their procurements and not get constantly bogged down in dealing with procurement challenges? And the consultation is open for responses. Anthony Collins we're working up our response, and we'll be submitting that, and we're producing a series of e-briefings going into a bit more detail of our thoughts. So do look out for those.
Thank you, Martin. So I will hand over to our chair to ask nice questions, please.
Yes, thanks very much, Alex. Unfortunately, I can't promise that the questions will be nice, but luckily I don't have to answer them. So yes, thanks very much to everyone who sent in questions. We've had quite a few, so apologies if we don't get to those questions. One of the first questions then, Alex, we have is obviously for either yourself or Martin. We have this new subsidy control state aid regime. Obviously, at present, we don't have any block exemptions. Under the previous regime, over 90% of state aid was awarded under GBA. The suggestion seems to be from a lot of commentators that the state aid rules continue to serve as a useful reference point against which to assess compliance with the 6 principles, albeit strictly speaking, the state aid rules won't apply in most cases. So, how are we supposed to reflect all of that in a contract term and a funding agreement in the interim?
My first comment is, yes, I've seen lots of commentators criticising the lack of block exemptions, advocating for us to stick with state aid, and I've got to say I'm dead against that approach. I think, how long have we complained about the state aid regime for us now to have an opportunity to at least make use of some admittedly limited areas for deregulation, just to make the whole thing a little bit more workable in real life, for us to then lean on pre-existing state aid principles, I think would just be a wasted opportunity, first of all. Secondly, I've engaged in, both Alex and myself have engaged in a few subsidy issues so far of those early days. I've come across one where the contracting where the funding body was keen to rely on state aid principles. It caused a lot of confusion, whereas actually the new regime, though complicated, it is fairly well. It's complicated to administer, but it's doable, and it doesn't work by reference to state aid principles. Actually, even though there's a lot of similarities, and I think getting bogged down in the previous regime just doesn't work. In terms of dealing with a grant agreement, I've actually got an instruction on at the minute for me to do just that. So I haven't actually done it yet, but I don't think it needs to be overly complicated. Most funding agreements will have an obligation to comply with state aid, linking through to clawback. Broadly speaking, it's just about doing the equivalent here. If there's specific things that have been agreed by the parties, like for example, there's an agreement that the funding is going to be used for a certain purpose in a certain way, and that constitutes service in the public economic interest. Recording things like that in a grant agreement, I think, can be really helpful, because you've got a clear audit trail, decisions made at the time, provided it's a reasonable and fairly sensible decision. I don't think it's fair to just pass down the risk that it could be slightly wrong to the grant recipient. I think it's much better to be robust about it and say, this is what we've agreed, and actually then, as you know, we're all learning. If there were an audit, I would hope that common sense would prevail, rather than us taking the approach that might have been under state aid, where everyone panics and people start pointing the finger at each other. That's how I'd approach it.
I think I'd just add on the contrast that I have I've seen that there's another question about SGEI and where a grant actually hasn't been entered into in time for the change. And I've had that exact scenario where I had given all the advice on an SGEI basis in November, December, but for whatever reason the agreement hadn't been entered into. And so we on an urgent basis had to reassess how we sit under subsidy control. Having already drafted the contract clauses for SGEI, the contract clauses for subsidy control were not radically different because some of the broad themes, Martin's already mentioned clawback, are similar. Now, as we've said, it's early days. Maybe we develop our approach, and a lot of things at the moment are highly reactive given the very short notice of the new regime that's been had. I'd agree with Martin that I don't think we want to just wholesale rely just on the old block exemptions. You should focus on the principles that are set out in the treaty, but that doesn't mean that you can't borrow language from the old EU regime, because obviously that regime still exists in the EU and is supposed to be still compliant with these principles, but it shouldn't be about specifically referring to block exemptions, but it may be that some of the language is useful to help authorise things here.
That's great, guys. I've put in the chat, we've had a question about the Regulation 12 cases in the ECJ last year. There was actually two cases, two German cases. Those are in the chat if anyone wants to look into those further. Another question, I will just kind of summarize this one. So the local authority is involved with a joint venture partner for a redevelopment of a large site. If the joint venture partner will not be providing services, supplies, works, but instead acts more like a lender, what process needs to be followed by the council to select the joint venture partner?
So we're starting from a basis of saying there's nothing here that is procurable. I think whether it's a funder partner or I've had it before where it's a land promotion partner, but they're not actually delivering anything back to the authority. The position I always take where you are procuring a joint venture partner, but they're not going to do anything that's procurable for you or any other contracting authority, is you as the authority, when you come to decide who to select, need to be able to justify to members and also be able to defend in the event you're judicially reviewed, why you've selected that partner. How are you achieving best value through using that partner? How do they enable you to achieve your objectives? Now, whilst you don't necessarily want to run a procurement in terms of the PCR 2015 process, you can perhaps borrow some of the themes. So you might be looking at capability and capacity, track record, but then also asking them to present to you what they would offer to the partnership. You're presenting to them what you would offer to it. So although the process is different, I think there are things you can borrow from procurement. And I suppose the other key point here is it depends whether you've got a partner in mind or not. And certainly I've been involved in joint ventures between local authorities and registered providers for housing where there's clearly no procurable arrangement between the council and the joint venture or the RP, but there's a close existing relationship and a track record. So if you're in that scenario, you don't necessarily have to go through a process if you can justify the use of that particular partner to members and decision makers.
Thanks very much, Alex, and indeed, Martin. That was great. Very pragmatic advice, as always. We've had over 150 people join today, which I think is our best ever. Conclude is to, again, thank the team, Anthony Collins and Alex and Martin, for their presentation today, and I hope you all have a good day. Thank you.